Seascapes teeming with life, where nature is still in charge. We find adventure, and we seek solace in the cradle of the deep. We uncover stories told by watery graves that whisper of nature's fury. We study, learn, teach, reaching millions around the world. We free giants. We are all people of the National Marine Sanctuaries. We surf, paddle, fish, and relax. We are producers, tourism, and jobs, safeguarding billions in local economies. We honor the past, serve the needs of today, and provide and defend for the future. A future that depends on the capital of these protected places. What secrets remain hidden in the Cathedral of the Abyss? What life-changing discoveries will nature bestow? And what innovations will we forge on our quest? The answers will surface if we journey together.
Hello, good afternoon. We have a really exciting panel to wrap up our 3 days of Capitol Hill Ocean Week. We're going to be talking about Drawn to the Sea and why we explore. But first, we're very lucky to have Congressman Francis Rooney of Florida's 19th District here. He's a member of the Congressional Everglades Caucus, and he's a champion for water quality in Florida, so he definitely understands the economic and environmental importance of Florida's aquatic resources. But to me, what's more important is he loves boating, and he's a big scuba diver, so we're so fortunate to have him opening our panel today. Congressman?
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate those kind words. Compared to most of the things I have to talk about, this is certainly the most enjoyable topic. Like Chris said, me and my family are lifelong sailors and mariners, and we sailed across the Atlantic in 2000 and saw plenty of containers and nets and things floating around that I know that you all care about too. Gone around the Mississippi River many times on a small sailboat, and you see trees and nets and refrigerators and all kinds of marine pollution going out the Southwest Pass. And so have a little bit of familiarity with what you're trying to accomplish. We have a place in Abaco, Bahamas, and we've had it since 1992. And just since 1992, we've seen a degradation even in the Bahamas with the increase of chub moss in the summer when the water gets hot. We never used to have that. And then, of course, my house looks out over one of your important projects, the Rookery Bay Preserve, so I see a little bit of that. So I might mention I've got three really important priorities that concern the water and the marine environment, and a large part of why I ran for Congress is that we've had like one congressman for every year and a half down where I am for the past three congressmen, so we don't have a lot of clout. And the federal government is well over $1.5 billion behind funding its half of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, which was enacted in 2000 to save the Everglades, save Florida Bay, and to clean up the Lake Okeechobee watershed, which, as you may know, when it's rainy year like last year, puts out tons of phosphorus and nitrogen into Pine Island Sound and into the Banana River or the Indian River Lagoon on the east side. And like we had black water as dark as this all through Pine Island Sound, all through July and August. And so we have a lot of work to do. So that's kind of my number one mission. I was just talking to Chris. She knows Ken Calvert, who's the appropriator for Interior Department. I took him down to the Everglades and we overflew the Lake Okeechobee watershed, some of the different projects that we need funding for, showed him how the water comes down through the canals at 400 parts per billion, goes into these storage treatment areas, and it gets brought down to like 40 or 50 parts per billion, and then as it oozes through these water conservation areas, it goes into the park at 10 parts per billion. Basically, thanks to a lot of hard work by environmentalists, the Everglades National Park itself is EPA compliant right now. But what's not compliant is when we have high rains, all this water that goes down the Caloosahatchee River and the Indian River Canal, and that's what's killing us. So that's kind of my number one thing. And we just need a few $1 billion. You know, the problem with our our Everglades projects is they come in $500 million increments. The other thing I'm working hard on is to try to kind of go against the White House too, is to avoid offshore drilling in the Gulf. And when I ran for Congress, it's kind of funny. I've been on the board of one of the largest drillers in the world, Helmerich and Payne, for 25 years. So all these people, my opponents, put a picture of one of Helmerich and Payne's oil rigs on a card and sent it out all through the district and said, this guy must be for offshore drilling. It was great for me because that's the easiest thing in the world to be against as a mariner and a conservationist. And what I would tell them is, not only am I not for offshore drilling, I'm probably the only person you've ever met that's flown many times out to rigs on helicopters and has sailed sailboats all along the south side of Louisiana where you're never outside of a rig. And the reason we don't want offshore drilling, I'll mention this so that you can be a better arguer against it, is not just the rigs. There have been very few problems with rigs. You had that one problem out in California years ago at Santa Barbara, and the people, the gentleman on this panel probably know more of this than I do. And then we had the BP Horizon. The problem with BP Horizon, it never should have happened. And if it had been a less arrogant company than BP, it wouldn't have happened. That never would have happened with Chevron or Exxon or Shell, because we do offshore drilling for all of them. They couldn't hold a vacuum. They should have shut that thing down until they could get a vacuum. But they were arrogant, they didn't, and we got the BP. But those are pretty rare. The real problem is all of the workboats and supply boats and trash and garbage and pipelines and tank farms and mooring balls, big steel mooring balls, that it takes to accommodate the lifestyle on offshore rigs. And you just don't want that. What I did the other day, I was flying back from Naples to a family wedding in Austin, and it was a real clear day, and I took pictures of all the boat wakes coming off the rigs in South Louisiana going into a place called Grand Isle, and I've been sending those around all the Congress people so they can see what workboat traffic does to an area. If you've ever been to South Louisiana, you can see the ravages of that. And then the third priority is to work on our estuaries, which I think also ties into part of your interests. I didn't join the Everglades caucus, but I will as soon as we get past appropriation season. I wanted to keep all my powder dry, to keep a laser-like focus on Congressman Simpson, Congressman Frelinghuysen, and Congressman Calvert, who are the three people that most determine how much money we're going to get appropriated for the Everglades. So I didn't want to be distracted because the letter also went to Calvert, but I will soon. You know, we have three really important estuaries in our area, and one of which I look out into in my house is Rookery Bay. And then we also have the Ding Darling Refuge up at Sanibel, and then the big Charlotte Harbor National Estuary, which is a major project that also needs a lot of support. So it's really great to get to visit with you all. I'm thankful that there are people like you that are supporting the National Marine Sanctuaries. One of your benefactors and board members, Phil Stevenson's a good friend of mine, and I'd sure like to be as helpful as I can to preserve our marine environment. I remember scuba diving when I was ambassador to the Holy See off one of those little islands called Janutri, off of Rome, what they call the Tuscan Islands. It's exactly the one that cruise ship founded up on, the one where the captain was drunk or something, you know. And I remember diving that, and it was a beautiful, beautiful dive because it was like 100 feet. We could barely get the anchor on our sailboat down. And so you have this beautiful 100-foot dive, classic med dive, not a lot of coral or anything, but really nice rocks and beautiful water. And it goes right up to this little point, and the point's about 10 feet underwater. And I always thought, after that, I thought, man, it'd be easy for some bozo to cut that corner too fast going into the little town that's around the point, and that's exactly what that guy did. I mean, it's really horrendous, beautiful little rock outcropping out there. Now that thing's ruined forever thanks to that guy, in addition to all the people that were harmed by it. So we have to do all we can do to take care of our water. And I think I have a great appreciation for what you're trying to accomplish. And maybe time for a few questions or something. It's really usually more important to find out what other people are thinking instead of what I'm talking about. Any questions or anything?
I might have a question.
Sure.
Because I know people might want to get motivated. But yesterday, hopefully people can hear me. Yesterday we had Senator Sullivan, Senator Whitehouse, and Congressman Kilmer here. And the audience had a really, what I thought is an important question is, what do you do to engage fellow members to be supportive of ocean, coast, Great Lakes issues, environmental issues, and water quality issues if that's just not a primary concern for them? So how do we talk, how do we engage, how do we bring people into our conversation?
That is the $64,000 question. And, you know, in the intelligence business, they say MICE, money, ideology, compromise, and ego. And we have to use all those tools to convince people that our projects are just as important as projects to deal with inner cities, education projects, defense projects, et cetera. That's why I took Ken Calvert down there. That's why I took Kevin McCarthy a few weeks ago, did the fly around, got on airboats. We have a nice dinner at our house looking out over Rookery Bay, one of your things. So I think it's broadening awareness and also mainlining the programs. It's not kooky environmentalists out there, you know, it's people that really care about the marine environment and the role that the marine environment plays in the world, okay? And you don't have tourism without a healthy marine environment. The people down where I am, this is a fantastic district for me because I'm very conservative, but they're very conservative, but they're absolutely 100% pro-environment, pro-estuaries, and clean water in the Pine Island Sound and offshore. So, you know, we have to work to broaden awareness as it's a mainline project of stewarding our resources. If you go to Florida and you look at the impact of Orlando and you go down and look at the Kissimmee River and how bad it was when it was a channelized flood control project dumping bad water into Lake Okeechobee. And now you look at the rechannelization of the river, and in a very short time, nature has gone to work and is doing all the work to clean the water up now that we dechannelized it. And that's kind of the argument I made to Calvert and Frelinghuysen and these guys. I've been taking them and showing them my maps and my pictures, is that nature will do the work, just like in these saltwater marshes and estuaries. If you can just stop the pollution and the damage and the boat wakes and whatnot, nature will do an awful lot to help clean it up. And so it's kind of like an investment that you let nature work after that. That's what I've been working on. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of our projects, people don't get real buzzed up on. I mean, you know, you look at something like a new airport terminal, okay, or a huge post office or a VA clinic. I mean, you could see this huge thing and you could get real excited about this government structure. It's kind of hard to do that about a sluice gate or a drainage basin like A2 basin in the Everglades or a aquifer storage and recovery well, you know, but that's what we got to do. And once it comes alive for them a little bit and they can see where the water is going to go to and what the difference is going to be in the quality of the water and therefore the fish and everything that lives in there, and you start to talk about conservation and hunting and fishing there. Already in the Kissimmee, we've got people that are hunting, you know, the state leases us out for hunting and fishing. So it's just an awareness campaign, and unfortunately people that don't live on the coast or have water interest need to be convinced. Oh, great.
I know in Florida, it is a conservative state politically to a large degree. Sea level rise is sort of from what I understand, the way climate change issues are addressed in Florida and other areas. How are you and your colleagues addressing that in such a difficult political time in terms of climate change?
That's a really good question. I think that you're right. In Florida, at least down where I am on coastal Florida, sea level rise and temperature are a lot more important than thinking about the effect of greenhouse gases and industrial pollution, because we just don't have that. And what I try to always do is link it to the survival of Florida Bay and the Everglades, and that we don't want to wind up with like a Lake Pontchartrain dike around the Everglades to preserve Florida, to keep Florida Bay from sending salt water all the way up there. And it's a real problem for us. And, you know, like there's some maps that show 2/3 of Fort Myers could be underwater in like 50 years. And so I don't know that anybody knows how to stop it. I read some material that the water's been rising ever since the Ice Age, perhaps abetted by some natural or some human factors. But and I don't know what we can do about it other than maybe think about increasing freshwater flows south and west where I am that can help fight back against the rising levels. Perhaps more mangroves. Some people have said more mangroves. I'm not a real scientist, but it's an awareness issue again, that people have to come to understand that the water is rising. You can't do anything. We've got to do something about it, or we have to learn to live with it, one or the other. But it's not a good consequence. And down where I am, people get it. I mean, they may be Trump people, they may have been Cruz people, they may be brutally conservative about government spending and all that, but they get the environment, and they're all very concerned.
I just want to rise to thank you for some of the most cogent arguments for the environment I've heard out of Congress in years. And I live and work in the Southwest Florida. We, as our government there, we're a member of the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program, along with the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program and the Tampa Bay Estuary Program. But I feel that our environmental programs for this year and perhaps in years to come are under extreme challenge from the budget and OMB and their efforts to restate their priorities. And I can only ask that someone who is as lucid as you to continue your work to protect those small elements of programs at what should be very minor amounts, that they be protected, and that the Sea Grant program in the United States, programs like the Great Lakes program, and others be continued for the values that they return to our communities. And I want to thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. The Charlotte Harbor estuary is a huge estuary, and no one knows about it, even down where I live. We've got a lot of awareness to generate, but I'll do the very best I can. I think that's one area where I may be able to influence people, because I do know a bit about the water, having spent a lifetime on it, and I'll do the best I can. It's important. You always like to remind these Democrats that it was Nathaniel Reed, a Republican, who convinced Richard Nixon to pass the NEPA law and to buy the Big Cypress Swamp.
We're going to take one final question from
Hi.
who's a future ocean leader. I have to just say, this is
Great.
with the Scuba Nauts program. So.
All right.
Thank you. We're also from Florida. We're Scuba Nauts International. We're a youth diving and conservation and marine science organization. We're based mainly around the Tampa Bay area, but I was wondering if, how are you engaging the youth in your area, or if you have a plan to?
Well, we did a program in Naples here last year of building 6 artificial reefs, and we did one of them. My family did one of them. We call it Rooney Reef. I picked the one that was furthest out to have the best visibility for diving. And I think they're going to start a program to try to get young people out there and get them interested in scuba diving close by, instead of having to go all the way down to Key West to do it. Mario Diaz-Balart and I, you may not know that, but Mario's a scuba diver. We're going to go down to Pennicamp and do a dive and try to get some publicity for Pennicamp, out of it. As a team of 2 congressmen diving. There's some diving bell you can go down there and get in and take your tank off, kind of like a hyperbaric chamber or something, and hang out. And they'll get a lot of press out of that. And, heighten attention to it, Karen, is it Karen that's the estuary person up there? No, Martha Collins, the environmental lawyer. You know Martha? She's great. She gave me a stack that high of things about sea level rise. It's really comprehensive. I think it's every article ever written. Yeah, tell her hello when you get home. Thanks. Well, thank you all for having me, and you're always welcome to come by my office. You'll be inundated by charts of the Everglades and the Lake Okeechobee watershed when you do, so you'll feel right at home. Thank you.
That was a fantastic presentation. It was just so good to have the congressman here and talk about how he actually decided to go and run for Congress because of how much he cared about oceans and water issues. So that was fantastic. So while we move our panelists up here, why don't we have the messages from our sponsors? Thank you. Our final panel presentation is going to be a little different, so I just want to let people know this. First, we're going to start off with Mr. John Dolan from the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York, to talk about the early history of exploration. Then Larry Muir, professor and director of the University of New Hampshire School of Marine Science and Engineering, will speak. So we'll have two kind of longer talks, and then Jerry Miller is going to come up and do a moderated panel. So just to let everybody know it's a little different. Think about questions throughout both presentations, and then when Jerry comes up and does moderation, we'll be taking questions of both panelists. So with that, John?
Thanks, Chris. And thanks for being here today. It's a real pleasure to be representing the Wildlife Conservation Society and talking about why we explore. Could I get the first slide up, please? Thanks. I want to sort of take this question, and for the length of this presentation, I'm going to look at it through the lens of the Wildlife Conservation Society and our history. So that's a very specific way to talk about exploration. Because the Wildlife Conservation Society has been around since 1896. We started as the New York Zoological Society. About 100 years later, we became the Wildlife Conservation Society to better reflect the evolution of our mission. And we are now a worldwide conservation organization in the water and on the ground in over 60 countries. So we used to just run the Bronx Zoo and the New York Aquarium, and now we're all over the globe. But throughout all of this, there's been one thing that sort of identified the society's approach towards exploration. What is it for? Exploration is to create inspiration, to fire the imagination, to get support for conservation. That's the only reason why we take that science, because we believe without that advocacy, nothing's going to work. So I want to just take a little side trip to the terrestrial side here, because when we talk about the beginning of the society, you'll see how that was the very ground that we were built on. William Hornaday was the first president of the New York Zoological Society and the first director of the Bronx Zoo. And like all zoo men back in the day, he used to go out on collecting trips, these explorations out to bring animals back for the collection. But when he was out doing his exploration, one of the first things he saw when he went to the Great Plains was that this unimaginable abundance of the American bison, this sort of cornerstone of the American identity, was no longer abundant. In fact, that unimaginable abundance was now unimaginable scarcity on the verge of extinction. So Hornaday did what all good zoo men did back in the day. He crated up a couple of these animals, a few of these animals, brought them back to the Bronx Zoo, and he started a breeding herd there, and the circle went all the way around because those animals actually provided the foundation for the reintroduction of the American bison back into the Great Plains. But he did more than just that, right? He also wrote a popular tome called The Extermination of the American Bison. The reason to do that was to get popular support for the conservation of these animals. And in fact, that was key to turning the tide of the American bison. So to go to the oceans, let's look at the first director of the New York Aquarium, C.H. Townsend. Now, before he was director of the New York Aquarium, he was a U.S. Fisheries Commissioner. And he knew from his experience in the U.S. fisheries and as a director of the aquarium that the intense pressure on great whales was driving them towards the end. He had that feeling. But then he did something very interesting. He found over 100 whaling logs from the 19th century into the 20th century in the New Bedford Public Library. And he realized that he had a trove of data on something that we knew very little about at that time and still to this day, which is the distribution and occurrence of these great marine mammals. So what he did was he collated all that data into a set and started studying it and looking at it and putting it out there. Sorry, I'm going to need to advance that slide, please. And again. But he did more than just look at the whaling data. He realized as he was looking at these logs that all of these whaling vessels had been making ports of call in the Galapagos Islands, where they were picking up hundreds of Galapagos tortoises, flipping them upside down and putting them in the holds of their whaling ships because they would stay alive for months and provide fresh meat for the crews on these lengthy voyages. So we realized that the same forces that were driving the great whales towards extinction were also driving Galapagos tortoises towards extinction. So being a good aquarium guy, he went out and collected a bunch of Galapagos tortoises, distributed them to collectors around the world, including the Bronx Zoo. Some of those animals collected in the early 1920s still alive today. And their offspring actually were the foundation of reintroduction into the Galapagos Islands of some of these tortoises. But he also did something very smart. He wrote public tracts about what he had found in all of this and drew some very strong conclusions about where we were going towards extinction with the great whales and towards extinction with the Galapagos tortoises, because he wanted to build public support for their conservation. One last thing that he did is he created a document that was scientifically brilliant, the collation of all this data about whaling over 100 years and more. But he also incidentally created a very beautiful document that caught the public's imagination. This document, they're known as the Townsend Maps, and they're still used by marine scientists today because we still know so little about the distribution and occurrence and seasonal movements of these animals. So from Townsend now, that brings us to the amazing Mr. Beebe. William Beebe was truly an interesting person, a raconteur, a socialite, a friend of Teddy Roosevelt's, as at home on Fifth Avenue as he was in the jungles of Indonesia. But he was also a really broad thinker and a very creative individual, very insightful. Excuse me, go back. There we go. One of the things he did on all of his collecting expeditions was, of course, they all start with a voyage, right? So Beebe is going across this water, and his inquisitive mind is, I want to know more about that water, even though he is an ornithologist. And he was frustrated because he wanted to make connections with habitat, right? But he couldn't get below the surface of the water, and it was quite frustrating for him. And he knew, quite literally, that we were just skimming the surface of what we could see, of that 90% of the Earth's life. So he wanted to get deeper, and he started kicking around ideas, and he ran into an engineer named Otis Barton. And Otis Barton said, listen, if you want to go deep, you got to go in a sphere, because that's the only shape that's going to stand up to that kind of pressure. So Beebe's like, yeah, let's do it. So the two of these guys, two 6-footers, crammed themselves inside a 4-foot in diameter cast iron ball, right? Because what better way to find out? They bolt it shut, and they toss it over to the side to see what they can see. And what they saw was amazing. And remember, nobody had been deep at that point. And they were fortunate because William Beebe was an eloquent, articulate, close observer of life. And what he saw was amazing. Life that had not been seen, we hadn't got that deep. And he could describe it. And not only could he describe it, he could see it in situ. He could see it in the environment. We'd never seen those behaviors before. We'd never seen anything like the anglerfish with this luminescent lure hanging out there and these jaws that would open up and swallow. And how do we know about all those things? How do we get those drawings? Because Beebe sat there and articulated everything he saw through a telephone line that went up to the deck of the ship, where it was written down and illustrators drew up what he described. And I just want to take a second here, because I was putting together this presentation, and much to my dismay, I realized yet another presentation about white men. And classically, about dead white men, except for Roger Payne and myself, I think. But I want to give shout out to William Beebe, because back in the day, somebody who was so thoughtful and so out of the box in his approach to so many things, extended that to culture. He was a great supporter of women in science back in the day when it did not happen. We would call William Beebe woke today. He was a supporter, he was a mentor, and he hired women scientists. Two of the women that were on those expeditions, Gloria Hollister and Jocelyn Crane, went on to have not just careers with the society, but leadership roles in the society due to William Beebe's support. Rachel Carson thanked William Beebe in her dedication to the sea around us. So let's go back to Beebe and Barton, though, because they've been doing this now. They've been going on these dives, a little trial and error. They've seen a lot of cool stuff. They keep getting deeper. They keep getting deeper. And then finally, on August 15th, 1934, they toss it over the side, and they go down as far as they've got cable to go, over 3,000 feet, a half mile down. Remember, this is a time when no one had been deeper than 300 feet. Absolutely amazing. It was like the Apollo landing, right? It's like one little dive for man, one giant plunge for mankind. But unlike the Apollo landing, of course, these guys were going down and finding life. And we were so lucky that we had William Beebe, because he was hooked up to the NBC radio broadcast, live casting this entire thing, describing what he saw, firing the imaginations of the American public. It was truly, truly transformative. It became viral. I think we would call it viral today, right? And they even made like a cheesy movie about this thing, Titans of the Deep. There it is. And Beebe, you know, he was a generalist, he was an ornithologist. He got a lot of flack because a lot of people didn't really believe what he was seeing. And it wasn't until 30 years later, when the next generation of exploring vessels came along, that he was vindicated in a lot of what he saw. And that brings us to Roger Payne. So hydrophone technology, we knew that whales made noise underwater for a long time. People have been in the water enough to know that. Hydrophone technology was developed by the Defense Department in the early 60s to listen for submarines. And they started hearing a lot of noise under there. Roger Payne and his colleagues took that hydrophone technology to the next step, and they listened to the great whales. And sure, they put out scientific papers. McVeigh and Payne put out a paper about the humpback whale songs they were saying, but when they analyzed those acoustic signatures, they realized that they were hearing something absolutely amazing. This beautiful, repeated sound of the humpback whales. And so what did they do? They put out a record, right? And it was great. And I'm looking at this crowd. I'm probably the only person who can say this. I was there. I'm one of the few people that can remember, and on one of the few that's bravest to actually admit, that I remember listening to Graham Nash sing to humpback whale songs. But that's not all we did, right? The New York Zoological Society and the National Geographic Society put that on a 45 RPM vinyl record and stuck it into a National Geographic magazine and sent it out to America and the world. It was the most widely distributed audio recording in history at that time. And it goes a lot further than that. Before I go on, I just want to mention, if you want to talk about distribution, the sound of the humpback whale is on the Voyager spacecraft, billions of miles from planet Earth, as a representative of songs of the Earth. That's pretty cool. So one quick thing back to the New York Aquarium. We had a lot of people in the field. We had a lot of people at our facilities. Dr. George Ruggieri is one of my favorite guys at the aquarium. He was a PhD in marine biology and an ordained Jesuit priest. So somebody who was both a biologist and a parish priest was, of course, really interested in those things that would bring healing and succor to people. So when he was director of the aquarium and head of the Osborne Laboratory for Marine Science, most of his research focused on how the biochemistry and pharmacology of the sea could function to provide healing for human beings, particularly in fighting cancer. And in fact, he wrote a book that was very popular, and one of the first voices in bringing together these ideas, that the health of the ocean is tied inextricably to the health of human life. So that brings us to today. At the New York Aquarium, we're really lucky because the Wildlife Conservation Society has global expertise in research, education, and outreach on conservation issues. And we have a program at the New York Aquarium called the New York Seascape Program that goes from Cape May to Montauk in the New York Bight, into the estuary and up into the watershed. That's all about research and outreach on these waters. Urban conservation is where it's at. 20 million people in the tri-state area, right? And yet something truly amazing, which is that the wildlife that existed when it was just the Lenape on the fishing villages of the Mannahatta Island are still depleted but intact in these waters. It's an amazingly biodiverse place with a lot of human economic activity overlaid over that, right? So we can use these charismatic megafauna to tell stories to get people excited about these waters. So we're working with Woods Hole to acoustically monitor whales in the New York Bight so that we can minimize ship strikes in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. We're tagging sharks, and I'll show you a little video about what we show our high school kids when we take them out. We continue that work today in the New York Seascape program. Our tagging of sharks is not just to understand sharks, it's to understand the way they use these waters off the shore of New York.
Whenever the animal comes near the surface, the antenna that sits on the tag, which is on its dorsal fin, when it breaks the surface, if a satellite is passing overhead, it will send positional information, GPS information to the satellite, which then we will download to our data so that we can actually track the movements of the animal.
So we're hoping to tag a few of these guys and learn their migration routes. And in helping mako sharks, we can hopefully help other species that swim in the New York Seascape.
That is Shark Tank. Let's put a tail rope on him.
So it's 4 feet. Put it in the water, so it's kind of like a jet on right towards the movement.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah. Just like that.
It's coming, brother. You ready? Yeah. Don't let it go.
Let it go.
Look at him go.
Yeah.
Kicking hard.
So we keep telling these stories. We keep looking to inspire imagination in the support of conservation. Now, BB had his voice, his articulate demeanor, and a phone line. We've got a $150 million exhibit that we're building at the New York Aquarium to tell these stories about New York. What started out as a simple shark exhibit has grown to be springboarded into something truly amazing in terms of describing not just New York waters, but those features of New York waters which most people will never have the chance to see. We've talked about how little people can see beneath the surface, but certainly when you're talking about the Hudson Canyon, the largest submarine canyon on the entire Atlantic coast, and one that is, of course, right offshore of New York, few New Yorkers know about it. So to create an exhibit that tells that story, that in essence serves as a visitor center for that place, is a great opportunity. And in fact, it's the New York scientists working out of the aquarium who were instrumental in naming the Hudson Canyon and nominating it for a national marine sanctuary. And it's moved into inventory, and this exhibit will continue that process as we move forward. Coming 2018. You notice that little plug down there? So we didn't just stop there. Remember Townsend's maps, things of beauty and things of information? Well, we did the same thing when we created a map with the National Geographic Association of the New York Seascape, where we have the Hudson Canyon outlined, we have the human overlay and the wildlife there, and on the other side, just beautiful representations of what New Yorkers don't know and can't imagine unless they listen to us. So why are we doing all this at the end of the day? You know, it's been a very difficult game in New York to sort of raise this ocean consciousness, because in New York there's so many things, there's so much competition for the voice, right? Yes, we've got the ocean, but we've also got Broadway, we've got Wall Street, you know, it's difficult. But something's happened recently that I think that's really changed that conversation. Sandy changed that conversation. Sandy gave us the opportunity, so to speak, to really talk to people about what it means to be a city of islands living in a time of dynamic climate. What happened at the aquarium is what happened to the city of New York. And our location in New York on these waters perfectly situates us. And our history of telling those stories, inspiring people to conserve, is what keeps us going. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, John. I'm going to continue on. That's a very, very tough act to follow. See if I can get the first slide here. I'm going to take a little different look at ocean exploration. I'm going to take it a view from the context of mapping the ocean and mapping the seafloor. But let me start by talking about what drew me into exploration. And it really has a lot to do with what we've seen all day today and all week, really. It was really the images. It was people like Jacques Cousteau who showed these absolutely spectacular images of things I didn't quite understand. I didn't really know what they were, but they were beautiful. And they sent chills through my spine. And still today, when I see many of the pictures we see today, it sends chills through my spine. And it was a realization from people like Jacques Cousteau and Bob Ballard that it's our visual system, that's the little eyes up there, that we really depend on. About 60% of the brain's functions are connected to the visual system. And so they can bring the ocean to us visually, and that really was important. And again, these things, I'm a dumb geophysicist. I don't know what these things are. They're just beautiful, though. And they really, really excited me. And so I wanted to explore the ocean. And we also get images of this amazing maritime heritage we have down there. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of wrecks, still undiscovered. And even things I do understand a little about, and that's the seafloor. But again, beautiful images showing us processes that we never understood before. And so we're very lucky in this day and age. It's easy to image the Earth now. We can go to Google and we can just zoom down anywhere and get amazing imagery of anywhere on the Earth. And we have to be careful. Be careful where you sunbathe, because this is taken from space. But that's really the green and the brown or the concrete part of the Earth. What about the 3/4 of the Earth that's blue? Well, if I do the same thing and zoom in on that 3/4 of the Earth that's blue, all I end up seeing is this. Because unfortunately, the light that we so depend on for our vision system just doesn't penetrate into the ocean. And so we have to find other ways to penetrate into the ocean and see what's there. And we're fortunate. People like the NOAA Ocean Exploration Program and others have built instruments that let us penetrate into the ocean, can bring us much closer, can bring those cameras right down to the bottom if we want, but we can't get around the fundamental physics. We can't get around the fact that light just doesn't travel very far. So the field of view for any one of these cameras is really only a few meters, and we can only capture that kind of imagery a few meters at a time. And so one time I sat down and I said, what would it take if I wanted to image the entire ocean? What would it take? And actually, Google called me up once and asked me the same question, so I was glad I had done it. And that was the answer. If you only have a couple of meters field of view at a time, that's all it'll take us. I can't even say that number, 600 trillion, whatever, zillion photographs. And how long will that take us? Well, if we figure out got to get down, it takes us so much time to move along and so on. I figured it would take about 10 billion years. And I'm a patient person, but I'm just not that patient. So it's not going to work that way. We're never going to be able, in our lifetime, your children's children's lifetime, to be able to take advantage of that visual system and capture the entire, just the ocean floor, let alone the water column. And so we have to look at different ways. And people have been trying to penetrate that seafloor and see what's down there in different ways for a long time. We heard about BB, but long before that, this is from a tomb, a statue that was found in an Egyptian tomb, 2000 BC, and right up in the front there is an Egyptian ocean mapper. He has a hunk of lead with a piece of rope, and he lowered it down to measure how deep it was. So 2000 BC, using another sense, not as good a one, touch, but going to another sense. The next picture I was able to find is about 3,500 years later. Wood carving from the Thames River, and what are they doing? Exactly the same thing. 3,450 years, no change in how we measured what was at the bottom of the ocean, just a hunk of lead at the end of the rope. But if I jump 500 years now and we look at what happens in 1940, what are they doing? Exactly the same thing. 4,000 years. There were a couple of minor innovations like piano wire and things like that instead of hemp, but that was it for 4,000 years. Until about the time of the Second World War. It was really in between the wars, but really perfected during the Second World War, the use of echo sounding and sonar to map the seafloor. And the idea that sound, unlike light, travels very, very well in water. And so we can send the sound out, it'll bounce off the seafloor. If we know how fast sound travels in the water column, we can get an idea how deep it is. And so now we're taking advantage of another sense. Still not as good as vision, but we're taking advantage of hearing. The problem with that sound is it travels and it goes out in a big, big circle just like if I held the flashlight, and I usually have a little prop. You'd see a little tiny flash, a little mag light will make a big circle on the ceiling. Well, the same thing with the sound. It makes a big circle of sound on the seafloor, and we only get back one depth from that. So we're getting a very blurry picture of the seafloor with this technique we call single beam echo sounding. And from that, people had these echo sounder tracks. They would have individual ship tracks, my alma mater Scripps there, all the ships leaving out of Scripps with an echo sounder. Somebody would use their imagination, connect the dots, and make these contour plots. And that was really the best we could do. If we apply modern visualization techniques to the sparseness and the blurriness of this data, it looks something like this. That's what the seafloor would look like. But then about 20, 30 years ago, a new technology came along, something we call multi-beam sonar. And this really revolutionized the way we can see the seafloor. Instead of that big spot on the seafloor, now we had hundreds of tiny little like laser-like beams of sound across a wide swath simultaneously. Each one of those little yellow dots there, an individual sounding, very, very accurate. And it gave us a tremendously different perspective of the seafloor. If we take a look at that same piece of seafloor from our single beam sonar data set, and this actually includes some amazing information about the depths from satellites that I won't go into now. But if we just have one swath of a ship coming through it with a multi-beam sonar, it looks like that. And as it says, what a difference a swath makes. It's like putting on sharp glasses, and suddenly we can start using visualization techniques. We have the density of the data that we can now start taking advantage of our visual system and see what the seafloor looks like. And it really revolutionized the way we look at the seafloor. This map I showed you, this was about the best map we had of what the seafloor off the coast of Southern California looked like in 1999, 2000. And I'm old enough that that's not that long ago. Some of you probably weren't even born yet then, but 17 years ago, that was the best picture we had. A colleague and I just spent a few months out there with a multi-beam sonar, and we turned that picture into that picture. And again, it's this idea of this new perspective that has so many new insights into what's going on, into processes we never saw before, and many, many new applications. From an exploration perspective, it is the most critical one because mapping is the key to exploration. It's what we always do. The great explorers were always mappers first. Lewis and Clark, Magellan, Captain Cook, what did they do? They made maps. We can't ever explore until we understand the context of what's there. Hudson Canyon, that was a pretty map you had, but believe me, there's a lot more detail to what goes on in there. Unfortunately, exploration doesn't pay the bills all that much. And so there are many, many other very important applications for the mapping. Safety and navigation. We must make sure ships don't run aground. We need to understand how deep currents circulate, and we only can understand that by understanding where there are sills, where there are passages that water can flow through, and that drives the distribution of heat of the earth and current. Before cables and pipelines are laid down, we have to have accurate maps. Where a tsunami will do damage is totally dependent on what the depth distribution is. And of course, in our triad of defense, we have a part that's underwater, and it obviously needs to understand what's going on for national security. There's one other aspect, and that's driven a lot of the mapping that's gone on in the last 10 or 15 years, and that's not national security, but sovereignty, or sovereign rights over the resources of the seafloor and the subsurface, a right of ownership and a right of protection. And that's through the Convention of the Law of the Sea, which has in it one little article, Article 76, just 617 words, that actually, crazy, I call it the audacity of the lawyers, redefines the continental shelf from a geologic phenomena that you and I know about, that flat part, to a juridical continental shelf, which has to have certain characteristics. You have to go out and map to determine what they are. But if you define this juridical continental shelf, it allows a coastal state to extend its sovereign rights beyond 200 nautical miles in many places. And in some places, like the US in Alaska, it can go on 500, 600 miles beyond the shoreline. And so it's a tremendous opportunity to both extend your rights over resources and extend your ability to protect those resources. It's a double-edged sword in that sense. Now, the US has not acceded to the treaty, very sadly, but we follow it as international customary law. And for the last, 10, 13 years, our lab has been going out and doing this mapping that's necessary to define the extent of the extended continental shelf, the limits of the continental shelf, we call it in legal terms. We've mapped about 2.6 million square kilometers. You can see all these places where the US has a potential for this extended continental shelf. And every time we go out and do that, we make new discoveries. We see things like we've never seen before. And it has some ramifications on this process, but it's so much more in terms of what we're learning about how the Earth works. So here's just an example up in the Beringian margin off Alaska. This is the best data we had before we went out and mapped, and that's what it really looks like. And you can see the complexity and the processes that we can see going on. If we look at an area around the Marianas, where we see an indication of a few seamounts there, the real data looks like this. You can see these processes of channels and flows. A seamount that came up to 16 meters, that's a hazard to surface navigation. That was totally unmapped. And many, many more less than 500 meters, each one of those a hazard to submarine navigation. And indeed, we had a few years ago a very tragic experience with a US submarine running full speed into an uncharted seamount, of which there are thousands more. The area that we've had the most focus on has been in the Arctic. As I mentioned there, we have a tremendous potential to extend north of Barrow, Alaska, in an area called the Chukchi Plateau. The US has only 2 working icebreakers. Fortunately, one of them, I should say, scientific icebreakers, large icebreakers. There are many that work on the Great Lakes, but scientific icebreakers. Fortunately, one of them has one of these multi-beam sonars on it, and over the last 10 years or so, we've been able to map about 420,000 square kilometers in the least mapped part of the world. And again, important for our extended continental shelf, but more important in my mind because of the new discoveries. Many new seamounts discovered. Here's one that was 11,000 feet high. Pockmarks, indication of gas escape that have been the target for lots of NOAA ocean exploration cruises since, trying to understand the chemosynthetic communities that might live associated with that gas there. Indications of not just iceberg scours, but these what we call megascale lineations, indicating a mile-thick ice cap that covered the entire Arctic, totally making us rethink the idea of what happened in the Arctic through the ice ages. And to me, the most mysterious one on a place, you'll see where that little circle is, called the Alpha Ridge, an area of absolutely chaotic seafloor. We have no explanation for this. Well, we have one crazy one. We've only seen examples of this where meteorite impacts have taken place, and perhaps an area of a meteorite impact way up there. Again, it's just the excitement of discovery, things we had no idea were there, that we find every time we look more closely. This mapping technology also opens up this world of maritime heritage. This is the caissons at the Mulberry Harbors on Normandy Beach. But we can now, with a single pass of the sonar, get this unbelievably detailed mapping of a vessel. Would have taken us days, weeks, months if divers tried to put together, or cameras tried to put together a picture like that. The most exciting new development has been moving up out of the seafloor. We're looking at the water column. And we started to look in the water column mostly for fisheries objectives, but we're finding now that it's giving us some amazing insight into the oceanography. You can see in there a breaking wave, an internal wave, breaking in the water column. And most exciting has been the ability to map gas. Gas is an amazing acoustic target. These systems are tremendous in looking at natural gas seeps and unnatural gas seeps. And it became very, very important during the Deepwater Horizon event, where we were brought in to try to map the deep plume that was spreading across the Gulf, but more importantly, to monitor the integrity of the well once it was capped. This has turned into a whole new field, really, both from an exploration perspective, but really from a climate perspective, where we're looking at a whole source of methane from natural seeps that's been unaccounted for in the climate models, and we're starting to now to try to be quantitative about that. And finally, with respect to looking at the history of climate, I just had to show you this because it's the most beautiful place I've ever been. The seafloor contains a wonderful record of the history of things like glacial interactions. And so we went up to a place called Petermann Fjord, Petermann Glacier at the very northern tip of Greenland. And this is one of the few places left that has a floating ice shelf. The floating ice shelves buttress the Greenland ice cap from going into the water and starting to degrade very rapidly. There are only 4 left. This one has started to degrade very rapidly. 2010, huge piece broke off, 2012, and so on. And so we went up there to try to understand its history. What's driving that fast breakup? That's what we knew about the seafloor before, but that's what we know about it now. And as we can go and look very closely, we actually can see the path of the glacier. We can see where it stopped, where it slowed down. We take cores, we date it, and we understand the climate changes that took place that were tied to the movement forward and back of the glacier. So we can recreate the history of glacial interaction just by mapping the seafloor. So what I hope I've done is give you an idea that we do have the tools to map our planet in an amazingly accurate way and an amazingly detailed way. Well, how much of it have we actually done? This is a plot of all of this multi-beam sonar data that's publicly available, collected by the National Geophysical Data Center. I have a different name now, NCEI. And it looks like there's a lot of it. But if we zoom in, let's zoom into one of those places off South America that looks almost completely covered. If I zoom in there, you see that it's actually a very, very small amount. Just about 13% of the global ocean has been covered with multi-beam sonar, with high-resolution multi-beam sonar data. What would it take to map the rest of it? You don't have to worry about the details. The bottom line is it would take about $3 billion. That's with current technology. We're working on new technologies. We're working on an idea of autonomous barges with multi-beam systems, autonomous sailboats with multi-beam systems in them. But who's going to spend even the $3 billion to do it? Well, you know, we do this quite a bit. We've mapped the moon to about 200 meter pixel resolution. It costs us $600 million. We've mapped Mars to 20 meter pixel resolution, and in some places 1 meter pixel resolution, and it costs the same $3 billion. So we're quite willing to spend $3 billion to map other planets, and I think that's wonderful. But what about our own planet? Our own planet, 90% of it looks like that. And so we have the capability, we can do it, but do we have the fiscal will? The bright side is that as an explorer and a mapper, there's much, much more to explore. And so in oceanographic talks, we usually end the talk with a sunset. This is an Arctic picture, so it's both a sunset and a sunrise at the exact same moment. That was it. Comes up, goes down. And so it's really not the end at all for us. It's really just the beginning. So thank you very much.
You can grab a water at the... Thank you guys very much for 2 amazing talks. I'm going to really briefly introduce Dr. Jerry Miller, who will lead us in our conversation. Jerry brings a great understanding of the need for science and discovery. He's currently the president of Science for Decisions, and he's also served at OSTP, previously working on oceans and science issues. So with that, Jerry, let me turn it over to you.
So thank you, Chris. I think it's really abundantly clear that Chris and the staff saved the best presentations for last today. This has been a tremendous session so far. Right? And I think it's wonderful that we're ending on the note of exploration. I've long admired and supported NOAA's ocean exploration program, and to think of the synergy that could be had between it and the Sanctuaries program, you know, that's a really powerful combination. So I'm pleased to be here today. I want to start with just very brief initial remarks, and I encourage all of you to be scribbling your questions really quickly because our time for Q&A is short. Get those to me just as soon as you can. I guess when I think about ocean exploration, I often hearken back to the olden days. I was fortunate recently to be on the island of Terceira in the Azores. And after my meeting there was finished, I was wandering around town and I discovered the monuments identifying the path that Vasco da Gama walked when he landed at the harbor and then made his way to the monastery on Terceira. As he ended his voyage, as he set foot back on Portuguese soil, after the first ocean voyage from Europe to India. So I think about the exploration, the discovery that happened on that voyage and in that time period. That was the year 1499, 518 years ago. Only 7 years before Columbus had discovered America. And only about 20 years later, Magellan's expedition did the first circumnavigation of the Earth. So that was a golden age of exploration. And I just have the feeling that we could be on the cusp of another golden age of ocean exploration if only we can develop that inspiration and guidance that you have both alluded to. So let me open with a forward-looking question. John and Larry, tell us if we're sitting here 100 years from now, I won't ask for 500 years, I'll cut you a break, right? Just 100 years. When people are looking back on the present time from 100 years hence, what should we want them to be talking about? What are the discoveries that we want that, third, fourth, fifth generation from now to be recognizing us for, that we inspired, that we initiated and carried out?
So, again, I unabashedly look at this through the lens of conservation. So for me, exploration should be in the service of science. Science is the basis for what we do. But it's also got to lift up something larger than that, right? We ignore the emotional content of what we do at our peril, and I think we've seen that in some of the debates about science recently. I would just say that if in the future they're not looking back and say, thank God they came up with the technology to explore that so well so that we could protect it, then we have missed the hugest opportunity of all, right? If the Hudson Canyon is just well known so that we can lay more cable through it, we're going to feel pretty sad in a few years.
Yeah, and I second that, but I turn it around, and I guess in 100 years, I'd hope there'd be a lot of things they weren't talking about because they knew. So we don't have to talk anymore about ships running aground and not talk about issues with habitat. Right. Because we understand the context and the environment so well that we can protect it. Right. The other side of it is that I am sure, just as we had no idea about hydrothermal vents 30 years ago or 40 years ago, I am sure that in the next 100 years, if we can maintain programs of exploration, there'll be things that we just haven't conceived about that we'll understand about the ocean.
If I can just follow on that, because sure. I think actually Larry's touching on something which is really great, which is, how does this tie in with the idea of ocean planning? So if exploration can clearly delineate those areas in which certain activities not only can but should be encouraged to occur, right, and give us the information we need to plan intelligently and for a vibrant economy and a vibrant ecology, then we're doing a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Good. So I want to move right away to an audience question here. We've seen already a bit of information about up-and-coming technologies, new things that we're able to do. Of course, Beebe's bathysphere was new at one point in time. That was a true innovation right. At that stage. So tell us a little about things that you think are on the cusp of being technologically available in terms of ocean exploration, and how you think those advanced capabilities might generate new information for us.
I think you should.
So want me to go first? Okay. Well, I mentioned a couple, but those are really incremental steps, and that's really the idea of bringing autonomy into play. And I'm talking about from a surface vessel. There's also obviously autonomous underwater vessels, and as they become more efficient, that's going to add a huge part. But I think if I look further ahead, I think the real gains are going to be in nanotechnology sort of issues and really micro sensors that can be scattered in a non-polluting way right. Through the ocean and really start capturing, as we can in some ways, the atmosphere, the processes that are going on.
I guess I don't know how many of you were at the gala Tuesday night, but we did a cool little thing with the virtual reality goggles, which, simple as it was pretty interesting. I think the idea of, again, once we explore and once we've mapped, how do we visualize that is a continuing question, right? Because again, people care most about that which they understand, and they want to protect what they care about. So I think virtual reality, which to my mind at least is still in a very crude state, right? It's nowhere near, and I have a mixed, I'm ambivalent about virtual reality because I think real reality is so critical, and I want to get people into that. But as we look in ways technology can help envision these places, particularly in underwater exploration where we just simply cannot be and cannot go, in a small way, that's what an aquarium does, right? It's this artifice where we clear away all the barriers and we make it visible. And I think virtual reality will be really important in that as we go forward.
Larry?
If I could chime in on that, I've often wondered, I think you can see it kind of in the background of my thinking in the talk. How come NASA's exploration budget is 1,000 times larger than NOAA's exploration budget? Again, it's wonderful, but why is it that people are so willing to explore space and not the ocean?
So let me tee off of that to get to one of our audience questions here. It's along the lines of how can we get media more engaged? How do we then use that media engagement to more broadly engage the public? So speak to that.
Yeah, so I think so what I wondered was if the ocean were truly transparent and we can visualize it the same way we can look up at the planets and the stars. And so I think that's what we need to do in terms of the technologies that I work on, the things you've been talking about, is to try to make it more transparent. If it's hidden, it's going to be difficult. It was just as the congressman was saying, who cares about that sluice, when they have a hospital they can see or a building you can see. And I think we need to work to make this absolutely visual.
Right. But I also think that, again, once you have that visibility, you have to tell the story. You have to be an emotional storyteller and not be afraid to bring that into play, because the media, again, is going to latch on to those interesting stories, right, that are told in a compelling fashion. And that's what will then get the attention of the public, and the public will support those things. So to the extent that we are willing to stand back and say, oh, well, there's the science, do what you wish, or rather tell a story that we believe is important and not be afraid of doing that, I think is really important.
Yeah. So I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here for a moment and answer a question that Larry raised, and that is, why does, in effect, I think you hinted at, why does NASA succeed in doing this and other agencies haven't? NASA has a tremendous public relations staff. They're funded to do that. It was part of their mission from the outset to engage the public. Many of our other federal agencies don't have that advantage. When they were created, that sort of broad public engagement was not part of the equation. So when we ask questions like, where is it here? Why do we know more about the surface of the moon than our oceans, as Larry pointed out in this presentation? That is in part simply because NASA was structured to do that.
That's right.
So let me then segue from that into a question that has also come in about the engagement with the public, and then beyond the public, engagement with Congress. Congress responds to constituents, right? So what do we do to get our ocean exploration constituents to let Congress know that it's just as important that we be able to see the bottom of the ocean as it is to see the surface of the moon?
You want me to go first on that?
Sorry.
Well, I think
I got nothing.
Yeah, well, it's a tough one. I think we have to bring it home to them in some way. We have to make it as personal as we can to them, and try to find connections to things that they find relevant. And I think with at least my interactions with Congress people, they're just like us in many ways. I have a few other pressures on them, but I think we can strive to find ways to explain things to them in ways that can resonate with them. And I think that has to be the path we take.
So the congressman raised a couple of particular geographic areas that are near and dear to my heart. I lived in South Florida, or for a while, lived in Miami, at a time when Florida Bay was still relatively healthy. Now it isn't. I spent a lot of time sailing and fishing in Florida Bay and Biscayne Bay. I also lived on the Gulf Coast, where we're losing land at some incredible rate because of one of the phenomena that the congressman mentioned, that is the cutting of canals through the coastal marshes and so forth, laying of pipelines and such. So I know from my personal experience that those are areas where our ocean needs attention. How do we get that sort of message out to communities inland? I appreciated the panel that was earlier in the afternoon talking about connections between land and the sea. How do we do more of that? How do we use our ocean exploration to engage those people inland who might rarely see the ocean?
Well, I think it's the same way in which, to get back to the previous question, how do we tell these stories that are essentially, perhaps not the most compelling? And I just one way to look at this: exploration, deep sea coral in New York waters, right? No New Yorker thinks that there's coral in New York, but there is coral in New York, right? And there's regulatory bodies which sit there in deliberation and make decisions about these kinds of things, essentially not in a vacuum. They get a lot of input, but what they don't get is a lot of public input because it's a pretty arcane topic, right? Well, the New York Aquarium went out and told this story to our guests, and we got a bunch of, when I say a bunch, I mean 15,000 kids signing on saying, you know what, deep sea coral is important to me because of the habitat it provides, because of the ancientness of it, and all these other reasons, right? And we sent those to the Mid-Atlantic Regional Fisheries Council, who was debating on this, and they had 15,000 kids' drawings up in the room while they were debating on this. And I think that really brought home to them the idea that, hey, this actually has impact and import far beyond our quote-unquote stakeholders when we're talking about these kinds of things. I think those kind of connections, and by the way, we did get protections for deep sea coral out of that, so big ups on all of that, and I think that's the kind of stories that make a difference, right? So to the extent that we draw connections, whether it's from the headwaters, to the harbor when we're talking about the Hudson, whether it's from Iowa to the Gulf of Mexico, we tell stories that make those connections. That's how we get people involved. That's how we allow people to see the connections, which are sometimes difficult, and they start to understand that we're all in this together and that actions have consequences.
So we have a really interesting question that's just come in the inbox here. And I'm, again, sort of inspired by some comments from the congressman. The question is, in an age of an increasingly large number of private actors, we're thinking now of the Google, X Prize, James Cameron, et cetera, does the government realistically have the primary leadership role in ocean exploration, or is it? Are there other actors that are more effective at doing this?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that because I've dabbled on all sides.
Yeah.
And I think it's phenomenal that we have this interest from NGOs and the private entrepreneurs. And it can be remarkably helpful, but it also can be ephemeral. Sometimes as quickly as that interest arises, it disappears. And so I think for certain aspects of exploration, particularly the archiving, maintaining, and maybe the seed aspects of it, the seed funding, I believe the government does have an absolute obligation, particularly when we're talking about something like the extended continental shelf, which will become part of the juridical nation. And so the federal government has it, and I think in my mind it goes beyond it. It's an obligation to understand the Earth.
Right. Public-private partnerships is the buzz phrase now, right? And I think that there's a lot of value to it, and certainly we've partnered very broadly across the spectrum, both with private actors and with the government. I will say that I completely agree with Larry, which is, being in it for the long haul, having the big picture, that's not necessarily the private sector's greatest desire or strength. And for good reason. I mean, they shouldn't be. But if you were looking, and I think the fishing industry is a perfect example of this, right? It's like, on a day-to-day basis, those guys got to make money. They got to make a living. They got to go out and they've got to catch as much as they can catch. If there's not a disinterested party, but a regulatory input from the government around that, those short-term questions drive long-term consequences. And I think that we need to be cautious about that. I think we need to, for sure, I think there's a lot of, especially on the technology side, I think there's a lot of really exciting partnerships that are available to us, but that certainly cannot take the place of the role of government at some level in all of this.
Good, thank you. We're nearly at the end of our time, and I want to give each of you 30 seconds for any final comments that you would like to make before we end.
I guess I would say that we're always driven to explore. It's just human nature. And so I'm confident we will keep wanting to explore. I just hope we'll have the wherewithal and the means to do it, because inevitably great things come from it.
Yeah, hear, hear.
Well, I want to bring it back to the National Marine Sanctuaries. Until I can get Larry out there to actually really detailed map of the Hudson Canyon, one of the things that's most exciting to us about this, the possibilities of the Hudson Canyon being a national marine sanctuary, is the way that leverages research and exploration money and interest and involvement. So I really want to see that happen. I think that it's more important, perhaps, than people realize, that we understand that urban marine conservation in particular is a puzzle that if we figure out, it has global impact, right? Because the way humans have developed and settled, almost every major city is on a navigable waterway. So we have an opportunity there, and I think the Hudson Canyon represents a great opportunity of establishing a national marine sanctuary, leveraging that status to get that exploration, to get that technology, to get that research done that will help further all of our goals.
Great. Let me thank the two of you and thank our audience for being with us. And I think Chris has a couple of final remarks.
I do, but let's thank the panelists and Jerry very much first. I think this was just an amazing way for us to close out Capitol Hill Ocean Week 2017, because I felt like in many ways it tied so much together, and our desire for exploration, the need for partnerships to get work done, looking at our history and how it leads to conservation. So I know we're running a little late, but if people do not mind just staying a little longer, I just want to wrap a couple of things up. Just trying to think about how you summarize 3 great days of presentations, and I'm just going to hit on a couple of key words that I do think kind of tie things together. And that's one is empowerment. We need to really empower people from all different walks of life, kind of as we saw in the panel earlier today, from the farms of Iowa to Colorado to our seas where we're doing ocean farming. So it's really about empowerment and all walks of life to engage with ocean conservation and Great Lakes conservation. Partnerships are really key. We need to give people a seat at the table. And I think we saw that through some of our discussions that we had with our members of Congress, where it's trying to find those bipartisan areas where we can all engage together and give people a seat at the table, allow for that collaboration and discussion to occur. Always recognize, though, when you're giving a lot of people a seat at the table, it's hard, but in the long run, it's much more beneficial. Optimism. I think everybody felt pretty optimistic about what's going on with our oceans. This panel about what we can do with exploration, the mission that's ahead from us, looking at our blue planet, but at the same time, let's be realistic and know that what we have to do is we have to take action to have optimism occur. It just can't be out there. We actually have to take action in order for us to do this conservation and to preserve these unique resources for future generations. And lastly, what I'd probably say is it was about being persistent. None of this, I did like it would be, what was it, $10 billion 10 billion years? Okay, none of us have that long, but we do need to be persistent in terms of what our efforts will be. So, so those were kind of the summary words that we kind of thought about as we thought about this conference. I want to take a few moments to just say some really special thank yous. First to our sponsors, and I know I've said this a number of times, but the fact that they're willing to year in, year out kind of offer their support so that we can engage in these kind of broad dialogues on our ocean and try to formulate action is so key. So to our signature sponsors, Vulcan, the Walton Family Foundation, and NOAA, a huge thank you. To our co-hosts, the Campbell Foundation, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and the Ocean Foundation. Also, very big thank you. And to our champion sponsors, the Phil Stevenson Foundation and IFAL, we really appreciate your support. This would not also be possible without a tremendous staff at the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, and also the team at Ocean Live who puts on programming in between our sessions, and all of the staff that support them. So I would really appreciate, and our dedicated volunteers. There's a bunch of volunteers here too. So I would really appreciate it if everybody could just give them a round of applause. And we've had a great production team, pre-con, that's helped out, and this has been a lovely venue. I think we've heard a lot of really positive ideas about having this in the Ronald Reagan Building, so that was a great venue. One final thing, and that is to mark your calendars for next year's CHOW, which will be back here in DC, January 5th, 6th, and 7th. So a little bit of a week earlier, but mark your calendars. We hope to see you all here. June. Boy, let's try that again. Hey, mark your calendars for June 5th, 6th, and 7th, 2018. We will be back here for CHOW 2018. Thank you very much for a really great conference.